Hello, second graders, and welcome to the second part of our math lesson for today. Again, we are doing lesson 8.8, which is titled Choose a Tool. And the essential question that we're going to be answering is, how do you choose a measuring tool to use when measuring lengths? So we were kind of introduced to two new tools actually that also allow us to measure objects, and those were the yardstick and the tape measure. And so what we're going to do is we're first going to introduce you to kind of each of the measuring tools that we can use to measure objects, and also kind of why they're different and when we would use each one. Okay, so this first page is going to introduce you to the three types of tools that we can use to measure objects. So the first one you're all familiar with because we've been using it in previous lessons is the inch ruler. So an inch ruler can be used to measure shorter lengths. So anything that's small might be measured with an inch ruler. So for example, a phone, like a cell phone, would be a good item to measure with an inch ruler. Something else might be like your shoe. Your shoe could be used to measure an inch ruler. One of the examples that they gave in the last video was a pen or a marker or a pencil. Those are things that you can use those are objects that you can measure with an inch ruler. Okay. A yardstick is longer than an inch ruler. A yardstick shows 3 feet. So 3 inch rulers make up 1 yardstick. Okay? So a yardstick can be used to measure greater lengths and distances. So greater lengths, again, a chalkboard, right? A window might be, if you have a large window like the one I do. If you remember from the example, I think it was in yesterday's lesson, where I kind of estimated my window. My window was 10 feet long. So a good tool to use to measure my window would be a yardstick, because yardsticks are 3 feet long. Okay, so those are just some examples of something that you would use a yardstick to measure. It also measures distances. So if you're measuring, you know, the distance from one stop sign to another stop sign when you're outside, that might be a good thing to measure a yardstick, or to use a yardstick for. Okay, and then the last one is measuring tape. And so measuring tape, it can be used to measure lengths and distances that are not flat or straight. So I think a good example that they gave in the last video to use a measuring tape with was a basketball, or any kind of ball really. You can use a measuring tape with, because they're not flat, right? They're kind of round. So you would use a measuring tape because measuring tape is a little bit more flexible, and you can kind of bend it and change its shape, so that way you can measure certain objects that aren't flat or straight. Okay, so those are just 3 tools that you can use. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go on to some activities where it's going to ask us to use. It's first going to ask us what tool we should use, and then it's going to ask us to actually find the length of these things. We're just going to answer the questions about what tool to use to measure these things. Okay, we're not going to find the lengths because a lot of, we're learning from home, so a lot of us have different sized books, different sized markers, all that kind of stuff. But if you definitely want to do that around your house and measure certain objects, then definitely do that. And then you can always just you can write down what you measured and how long it was in the Google Classroom stream. I'm sure Mrs. Zillahy and myself would love to see some of the things that you measure with different measuring tools and how long those things are. But for the examples that we're going to do here today, we're just going to decide what tool we would use to measure them. So it says choose the best tool for measuring the real object. Okay, and then again, you can measure and record the length or distance of your own objects if you would like to. Okay, but so the length of a book. If we think about a book, right? A book is not, first of all, it's not round, okay? So we don't really need to use a measuring tape for it, because a book is pretty flat. You can flatten it out. And it's also not 3 feet long, right? 3 foot long. I mean, there are books out there that could be that size, but for the most part, it looks like this is just a regular type of book. So we wouldn't use a yardstick to measure a book either, right? Because books, again, are not usually 3 feet long. So the best tool to use to measure a book would be an inch ruler. So an inch ruler is going to go right here. Okay, so if you would like to measure a book with an inch ruler around your house, then definitely do that. And you can, again, let me or Mrs. Zillicky know what you found and how long that book is. Okay, the distance around a cup. So if you think about a cup is not really flat, right? You kind of have to find a tool that's going to almost wrap around the cup, right? So when we think about the three tools that we learned about, inch ruler, yardstick, and measuring tape, which one do you think will measure the distance around a cup? I'm going to give you about 5 seconds to kind of think about which tool you would use to find the distance around a cup. Okay, so if you thought that a measuring tape would be the best tool to use, you are absolutely right. Because remember, measuring tape can be very bendy, it's very flexible. You can wrap it around things to find the distance around that object. So measuring tape would be a good tool to use for measuring the length or the distance around a cup. Okay? All right, so some other objects that we might be measuring with certain tools is the length of a chalkboard. So remember, we kind of talked about this one in the last video. So a chalkboard is very long, right? So first of all, you could use measuring tape to measure a chalkboard, but you don't have to. I mean, if there was the only thing that you had, then of course you could use measuring tape, but there's a couple other better options. And so remember, an inch ruler, right, is only 12 inches. There's definitely some chalkboards out there that are a lot longer than just 1 foot or 12 inches, right? So in this case, it might be best to use a yardstick to measure a chalkboard, because a chalkboard might be exactly 3 feet long, and you would only need 1 yardstick. So using 1 yardstick would be a lot better than having to use 3 rulers and lining them up perfectly and holding them all in place. It would be very difficult to do that. So a yardstick would make measuring something that long a little bit easier. So a yardstick would be the best option for a chalkboard. The length of a marker. I want you to take a few seconds and think about which would be best to measure the length of a marker: an inch ruler, a yardstick, or a measuring tape. Okay, so if you were thinking an inch ruler, then you are correct. Now, some of you might be saying, but a marker is also not really flat. It's not a flat object, and it's not, you can wrap a measuring tape around it. And that's very true, but you have to remember that we are looking for the length from the very start of the cap to the very end of the marker. That's the length of the marker. Okay, so you are right. You would be able to use a measuring tape to kind of measure around the marker, but we're looking for the length of the whole marker. And in this case, an inch ruler would be the best option, not a yardstick, because again, a yardstick is 3 feet long, and there's not too many markers in the world that are 3 feet long. So an inch ruler would be the best option to measure the marker. Okay. Let's take a look at a couple more examples. So another one is the distance around a globe. So when you think of a globe is circular, right? It's not flat. So this would be a good object to measure with measuring tape, because again, measuring tape is very flexible. You can bend it, you can wrap it around things, and that would be the best thing to use for a globe. The length of a classroom wall. So classroom walls, think about your classroom and think about the walls in your classroom. Okay, it would probably take a lot of time, and it would also probably take a lot of help from other people to use an inch ruler to measure one wall in the classroom, right? And even if you use a yardstick, it's probably going to take a couple people to do that and help you with that, right? But if you use a yardstick, remember, yardsticks are 3 feet long. So if you were to use the longer of the two tools, then the yardstick would probably cause you to have to use less people's help, right? So a yardstick would probably be the best case scenario to use for measuring a wall in your classroom. An inch ruler would take a very, very long time, and it would take a lot more people. A yardstick wouldn't take so much time, and it would definitely cause you to have to use less people to help you. Measuring tape, again, you could use measuring tape to measure a wall, but measuring tape is really more for measuring objects that, again, are not flat or round, that you really can't use an inch ruler or a yardstick to measure. Okay? So the last couple activities, I shouldn't say the last two because there's one after these two, but these next two activities are going to have us do a little bit of writing and explaining. So one of the problems that it says up here, it says Rachel wants to measure the length of a sidewalk. Should she use an inch ruler or a yardstick, and explain? So Rachel should use blank because, so think about it, she wants to use something to measure the length of a sidewalk. So sidewalks are pretty long, right? They're not like very short, especially if you go to like big cities like New York City or Boston or Chicago. Their streets are very, very long, right? So to measure the sidewalk, Rachel should probably use a yardstick, right? Because a yardstick is 3 feet, and an inch ruler is only 1 foot, so you would rather use the longer of the two. So what we can say is Rachel should use a yardstick because a yardstick, I'll move this up just a little bit so you can see it better. A yardstick is longer than an inch ruler, right? So a yardstick is longer than an inch ruler. So that's something that we can say because we're trying to measure a distance, right? So in terms of using a yardstick is going to be a lot easier to use because it covers more distance. It's able to measure a longer distance. Okay? So Rachel should use a yardstick because a yardstick is longer than an inch ruler. And you can even say something like, therefore, the yardstick will you won't need to use as many yardsticks to measure the whole sidewalk. Okay, so you can say something like that. This one says, what is an object that you would measure with a measuring tape? Explain why you would use this tool. So one thing that we can say that we've talked about, right, is a basketball. A basketball is definitely an object that we can use a measuring tape for, right? And so we can say a basketball is a good object to use a measuring tape for, because, and then our answer and our reason could be because it is not a flat or straight object. Okay, so that's just something. That's another. Those are some other ways that you can kind of explain your answers for questions like that. Okay. So our last question here says, Jim wants to measure some books to find a book that is 9 inches long. Which is the best tool for Jim to use? So our options are large paperclip, a cup, yarn, or an inch ruler. So right off the bat, we can get rid of 2 of these answers, right? Because we can definitely get rid of a cup, because remember, a cup, we kind of measure around a cup. We don't use it to measure. And it's also not a very flat object, and it also doesn't have any numbers on it, so you wouldn't know how many inches there are. Yarn is the same thing. You wouldn't be able to tell how long the yarn is to measure the book. You could use paper clips because paper clips are 1 inch. We kind of learned that that's one of the tools you can use if you don't have a ruler, right? But an inch ruler is probably the best option here because an inch ruler has those numbers of measurement. So you can exactly find out how many inches those books are. So in terms of this question, D is probably the best answer, which is an inch ruler. Okay, so hopefully you know the difference now between how to use those different types of tools to measure something, and I think you are now good enough to go on to Think Central and complete the assignment for 8.8. And just remember the different types of measuring tools and what you can use each one for. Okay, everybody? Good luck on your math homework.